chair. Thank you all for my patience. My mobility is low. So this is my question. If racial minorities were to write a letter to your school, what would be the 3 or 4 main concerns that they would want the church to address? And we're gonna just open response.
So for me personally, 4 years back, I think I might have been one of the things is working on.
You gotta mandate it. You can't just say, well, this is out there. You can't just read it. You gotta follow it.
You just have to speak 2 different languages. But, you know, when you talk about some of those racist attitudes, in Shelbyville, within the parish, it wasn't a majority opinion. That was a minority opinion right there. It was them kind of thing. And so I just pounded away at the language of we, because that was really important. Now, outside of the community, because I stood with Hispanic immigrants, sometimes I got withering criticism from people. You're supporting illegals. I'm serving people. You know, I baptized the first communion, the Spirit. I do my best.
We talk about all those pillars, but do we say enough about?
Well, and I think the bishops have said a lot of their documents, but your average.
Yes. May I have your attention, please? We would like, if there are any representatives from tables that would want to come up to offer a quick question or quick feedback or expression from our first presenter. We don't have time for every table to come up, but if there are a few representatives, please feel free to do so now. There will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end when, at our time for the panel.
Hi everyone. Say your name. My name is Denise Kelsey, and I'm a presentation guest. Racial minorities were to write a letter to our schools, both about the institution and the faithful. What would be 3 or 4 main concerns that they would want the church to address, or our schools to address? One of the things that we said is to address cultural appropriation. We also said to address situations relating to the use of racial slurs when reading literature in classroom settings. And then also addressing student behaviors where disagreements turn to a verbal derogatory situation or students using racial slurs.
Our discussion, the discussion at our table centered on, well, I raised the question. How do you begin to talk to people about racism who don't want to hear it anymore? They're tired of it. It was in the past, it was long ago. I don't want to talk about it. And so I think we ultimately came back to what our presenter said to us, those steps that you laid out for us. Another person at the table also talked about, we live in a very small rural community. We have a black church, we have a larger white church, and a larger white church. And there is very little that we do with one another in terms of talking about pretty much anything. We were a very welcoming African American community. One of our things on Saturday night, our church is filled with people from both of those 2 white communities. But very rarely are you going to find a black person who's going to go to either one or the other. So there's a lot of work to be done, but where does it start? It has to start somewhere, and it can't always be, white folk gotta change. We have some responsibility for that. And I just don't know, again, how do you begin to do some of those things that need to happen? And not just surface stuff. We need to really get down to what the issues are.
I'm going to ask the presenters to maybe jot down some of these questions, and so at the end of the panel, maybe you can have answers for people by the end of the day.
Our discussion started off on a very positive note because our friend Alita brought up that she still remembers when she was a 5th grader in 1953, 54, 55, somewhere around there, a church at Holy Cross, a priest at Holy Cross, said from the pulpit, racism is a sin, white flight is a sin. And to this day, when she and her classmates get together, they still talk about that. It touched their hearts. So all of us echo, we want our priests to talk about racism as a sin.
Coming from St. Bernadette Church, one of the things that we noticed is, first of all, gratitude for our USCCB bishops and coming out with their pastoral letters, etc. over the years. But we noticed one of the things, and Sister, you brought this to our attention, is that none mentioned forgiveness. And we felt like that was probably one places to start and to begin is with forgiveness from the Catholic Church.
My people encouraged me to come on here. To answer, and I guess I would answer, we discussed kind of both of the questions, and so really answering a concern that I appreciate Sister Anita bringing up in the 5 areas of ways that the church as an institution could address systemic racism as a concern as people of color, specifically Black Catholics, having the access, a seat at the table, a voice at the table, and roles of leadership, and roles in spaces where they can make decisions. And so putting on the lens from a school perspective, I think one way is to truly intentionally write within your handbooks, within your employee policies and hiring policies, to intentionally look at hiring people of color, African Americans.
Those who came up to offer that feedback, I think we can all say that we are off to a great start today. Our next presenter, I heard a couple of years ago, at Bellarmine, there's an event every February. I don't know how long they've been doing it, but the Virgin Society puts it together or hosts it, and they bring in speakers during Black History Month. And Father Dan was the presenter a couple of years ago, and members of our department went, and we just said, by the end of that, we said, we have to get him back to Louisville. We have to get him back to Louisville. So when we started planning this event and thinking about who we wanted to be as part of this day, it was absolutely unanimous that Father Dan Horan was going to be invited. And we are so thrilled that he is here. Many of you have a copy of his book, A White Catholic Guide to Racism and Privilege, and our office hosted a number of book discussions, and I think other parishes did too. And so we are excited to hear his words of wisdom and hear his perspective. And as a reader, I look forward to reading more of his books and the upcoming ones too. So please welcome Father Dan Horan to our reading.
I'm going to take a clue from Archbishop Fabre and hold the microphone. Can everybody hear me? I'm not sure if everybody wants to hear me, but I'm glad to know that you can, so that's good. Before I begin, let me extend as well my note of gratitude to the Archbishop, to Mrs. Annette Turner, to Ms. Janice Mulligan and the staff of the Office of Multicultural Ministry here in the Archdiocese, and to echo again my gratitude for all of you being here. I don't want to take too much time, so I will add my thanks perhaps if there's time to spare, especially in our panel presentation. But I want to begin first by looking back at St. John the 23rd, who in 1961 published an encyclical letter called Mother and Teacher. Let me just ask you, is it okay with all of you? Can you see everything all right? Okay, we want to make sure folks can see the screen a bit better. And in this encyclical letter, John the 23rd lays out a strategy. Some of you have already been asking this question. How do we put what we're hearing into practice? The questions that we're asking, the information that we're learning. And to many of us, this sort of format will be familiar. John the 23rd says there are 3 stages which should normally be followed in the reduction of social principles into practice. How do we put into practice what it is we say we believe as Christians? And he says, first, one reviews the concrete situation. Second, one forms a judgment on it, or interprets it. That's how the Second Vatican Council will describe it. Judgment has kind of a negative feel, right? Any sheep and goats out there know what I'm talking about. Using those same principles. And thirdly, one decides what in the circumstances can and should be done to implement these principles. So it's not a one-shot, one-size-fits-all. It's a process of discernment that we're called to. He says these are the 3 stages that usually are expressed in the terms look or see, judge or interpret, and act. I begin with that because I want to begin my remarks this morning with some seeing, some difficult seeing, especially for those who look like me, and I'm not just talking about the baldies in the room. I'm talking about my fellow white sisters and brothers and other siblings. In recent years, we've witnessed a formidable legislative backlash to the increased attention to racial justice and the persistent effects of American white supremacy that has surfaced in the digital age. For example, we saw early last year the newly elected Virginia governor issued executive order on his very first day in office that forbids the teaching of, and I quote, inherently divisive concepts, including critical race theory in schools. Shortly thereafter, in Florida, that governor advanced a bill that, and I quote, would prohibit Florida's public schools and private businesses from making people feel, quote, discomfort or guilt based on their race, sex, or national origin, and which is now making its way into implementation. In my own state of Indiana, House Bill 1134 last year sought to impose a similar moratorium on discussions of any historical facts that may cause what is called racial discomfort or guilt in Hoosier schools. The bill passed the state house last February before being stopped in the Senate, though some of the legislators in Indiana are continuing to advance the cause. And even here in the Commonwealth of Kentucky, the great place of Kentucky, similar bills were introduced last year by the Kentucky Senate, including Senate Bill 138, which according to the Louisville Courier-Journal explains that teachers can discuss historical events such as slavery and oppression, but should note such things rank counter to the country's founding values. I'll just pause there to say we've learned a lot from Sister Anita, a reminder and an expansion of our knowledge, and we know that's very, very questionable. The description goes on. It would also prohibit schools from requiring educators to discuss current events with students or participate in race-related training. The bill was vetoed by the governor, but was overridden, as many of you know, by the legislature and was made into law. Virginia, Florida, Indiana, Kentucky, these are not the only places seeking to pass such legislation. As of today, there are 44 states in this country with similar laws or proposed legislation in the works. What is really motivating these actions is a desire, I believe, to dampen or silence genuine truth-telling, historical analysis, and engagement with the complexity of our collective and individual pasts and contexts, which includes the persistence of systemic racism in a society that views whiteness as superior. The crusades against anti-racist pedagogy, resources, and knowledge more broadly have nothing to do with education. As one of my colleagues at St. Mary's College in Notre Dame, Dr. Drew Pierce keenly noted, it really has everything to do with politics. It's politicizing issues that are really about facts. He explains that these political efforts are aimed at, quote, shaping a generation of students to remain in the dark about our country's legacy of racial injustice and thus remain amenable to a politically motivated, racially regressive platform. Recourse to the legal system is not a new tactic for the social, economic, and political bolstering of white people in the U.S. Beginning with the oppression and genocide of Native North American peoples and the introduction of chattel slavery in the 16th century, as we heard, up through the Jim Crow era, explicit legal privileges and protections were granted to those who were identified as white in America. From the mid-20th century onward, due to signature Supreme Court decisions, it was no longer acceptable, or at least technically legal, to enshrine anti-black racist laws at the local, state, and federal levels. Therefore, as the philosopher Shannon Sullivan explains, and I quote, when it became illegal to grant social, educational, financial, and other advantages to white people's racial advantages became more difficult to identify and didn't go away. They just became more difficult to recognize. She says many white people thought that perhaps those advantages really had been eliminated, and the new laws were working to ensure equal opportunity no matter what one's race. And I will speak as a white person, as a white man and a priest in this church, in this country, in this context, that my sisters and brothers and other siblings of color, this is not news to you.
Yes.
However, as scholars, activists, and ordinary citizens alike have observed, there continues to exist a major disparity between the way that those identified as white are viewed and treated and protected in the U.S. when compared with black, indigenous, and other people of color. This phenomenon is what has been traditionally described as white privilege. In short, to borrow a definition from the anti-racist educator Francis Kendall, white privilege is an institutional rather than personal set of benefits granted to those of us who, by race, resemble the people who hold power positions in our institutions. One of the primary privileges is having greater access to power and resources than people of color do. In other words, purely on the basis of our skin color, doors are open to us, people who look like me, and that are not open to other people. And we heard the educator, the last comment from the table a moment ago, highlight a strategic way, a practical way that we can begin to address this disparity in our schools. I recognize that the term white privilege has become problematic in different circles and for different reasons over the years. Among those who wish to deny the reality altogether, those predominantly white populations of people who refuse to accept their own racialization and the consequences, and indeed the benefits of being identified as white in a systematically racist society, those folks' objections tend to rest on the premise itself. In other words, there's this refusal to accept that there are any benefits or advantages or privileged treatment bestowed on us, historically and today, on account of our racial identity. Such folks, though not universally, are often the same people inclined to decry so-called reverse racism. How many people have heard that term before? It does not exist. I'll say more. And the same sorts of folks are those inclined often to rally against institutional and policy correctives such as affirmative action, on account that the overt legal structures maintaining the supremacy of whiteness in this country have been overturned. Such folks commonly, if though inaccurately, describe our society and institutions as, quote, post-racist, and frequently claim that any effort to dismantle or correct for systemic racism is an affront to their own opportunities or freedoms. And I think we heard this as well in one of the table reporters talking about what you do with folks who just want to deny that this is an ongoing reality. And yet there are still others, including some scholars and anti-racist activists who also raise questions about the phrase white privilege as a useful term, if it's just too much a stumbling block. Not that the reality is untrue. However, recognizing the complexity of intersecting identities and constantly shifting social locations, especially when one considers factors like gender, class, sexual orientation, nation of origin, physical and mental ability, and so on. This has put focus on whether privilege is the best descriptor, whether it's ultimately helpful or not. For example, poor whites in rural Ohio or Indiana or here in Kentucky struggle to accept the reality of racial privilege when economic and social oppression is a real force in their experience, even if they might benefit from being identified as white in a systemically racist society such as ours. One can likewise imagine the kind of defensive posture that's adopted by somebody who might be a transgender person, right? A white transgender person, or a white disabled person, or a white person of some other social category that in a context is marginalized or overlooked or oppressed. Recently, work like that of the philosopher Shannon Sullivan on what she calls white priority over white privilege. White priority, whites come first, white perspective cultures prioritize. Or even a proposal that I made last year called the racist snowplow analogy. These are attempts to think about ways that we can maintain the reality of this unjust dynamic of racial injustice in our society, while at the same time continuing the conversation moving forward. Whatever we end up calling that other side of the coin of systemic racism, we are witnessing today a fierce backlash from folks who look like me, especially white people with political power, to the growing social awareness of racial injustice in this country. Many white folks cannot stand to reckon with the truth that such injustices have and continue to exist, and that the history, perception, and memory of the world as they want to recount it, as we, so many of us, want to recount it, is in many ways absolutely false. It's a lie. This visceral reaction, ranging from what sociologist Robin DiAngelo calls white fragility to what the historian Carol Anderson calls white rage, this, I believe, is fueling the push among white legislators across the country to once again codify the supremacy of whiteness into American law. I'm using, don't think the church is off the hook, by the way. I'm talking about our broader social context as a starting point. What are we seeing in the signs of our times? The tenor of those proposed legislative initiatives across the country is one of censorship, silence, erasure, and denial. It's a refusal to accept history. It's a rejection of reality. And it has one purpose. I believe it's to shield white people, especially white students, from facing difficult truths about their own identities and the impacts of whiteness on themselves and others. So today, what I want to do is to take a look at what is so often being denied here. To shine a light on what it is that others are trying to cover up, namely the meaning of whiteness and its impacts. I want to state from the outset that I recognize my own social location. I am a white, cisgender male, Roman Catholic religious and ordained priest. I'm a tenured university professor with U.S. citizenship. There's virtually no point of privilege, intersecting privilege, that I don't stand at. The privilege of hair, maybe. I do sit at an intersection of tremendous privilege, as do many others here, right? Who are identified by one or more of those same categories. Whether it's clerical privilege, racial privilege, gendered privilege, class privilege, educational privilege, think for yourselves. I recognize that my responsibility is, and this is so important, in part to address people who look like me and occupy similar social locations. And this is so important because I am not interested in speaking for anybody else's experience or on behalf of others. That is not my place, that is not my goal. I hope that what I shared this morning resonates with my sisters and brothers and other siblings of color, but I'm talking mostly to the folks who look like me, whether or not you have hair. So I want us to look squarely at what so many white people are trying to deny and erase at this very moment. I'm going to do so in 3 parts. First, I want to talk about what it means to be white. Next, I want to suggest highlighting ways that we can see the impacts of that whiteness in our society. And finally, I want to identify just a few suggestions for white folks like me moving forward in developing an anti-racist spirituality. Does that sound good to everybody? It doesn't matter, we're doing it anyways. I already loaded the PowerPoint. So what does it mean to be white? Learning about whiteness for white folks can be a startling reality because most of us white folks in the U.S. have been raised, we've been socialized, we've been taught, we've even been entertained and informed by a system that casts doubt on the very existence of whiteness as a racial category itself. And in the rare instance in which whiteness is acknowledged, oftentimes that same system denies it has any meaningful significance. To learn about our assumed racial identity when so much effort and energy has gone into denying it, ignoring it, and explaining it away is to risk encountering the many falsehoods that we whites have taken for granted as truth. It means risking the discomfort of knowing what has been invisible to us but has been plain as day to people of color. And to risk having to relearn a fair amount about reality and to forego faulty assumptions about who we are and how we are in the world marred by inescapable racism and white supremacy, especially in this country. I just want to say something as an aside about education, because I know we have so many educational professionals and teachers and students here. Part of the thing, as somebody who's given my whole life in ministry to teaching, that I find so upsetting about some of these legislative proposals that are interfering with school curricula and trying to silence aspects of our shared, though discomforting and painful history, is this claim that we don't want to make people uncomfortable. Two notes.
Yeah.
One, which people are we talking about? Second, though, more importantly, teachers, students alike, all of us who've been there and done that, know there's absolutely nothing comfortable about learning. And I mean that seriously. Because when you learn something, one of two things happens. You either learn something you didn't know before and it unveils your ignorance about something. I didn't know that. I was telling Sister Anita, I didn't know all that about Francis Scott Key until this morning. It showed a light on my own personal ignorance. The second thing is, learning is uncomfortable because if you come into the classroom, into a context where you think you know something, and you get taught something that corrects that, you have to relearn that, and that is also uncomfortable. So I don't know what a classroom looks like in which fourth graders are learning multiplication tables or high school students are learning about American history that isn't uncomfortable, especially for somebody like me who's terrible at math. One of the things that I think is really important is that we white folks, generally, we are at least unreliable narrators about race. However, women and men of color have long attested to the painful truths of racism and privilege in a white supremacist culture and narrated accurately these basic aspects of what it means to be white within such a context for generations. They can do this. Many of you are doing this because your experience at nearly every point of navigating life in a pervasively racist society is an experience of encountering subjugation, minimization, dismissal, rejection, and violence. All against the contrast of whiteness that's presented as normative, which people of color have never had the privilege to overlook or ignore. When we talk about white privilege, that's one of those things. Having the benefit of never having to think about race. When scholars and activists talk about the United States being a white supremacist nation, this is at the heart of that forceful yet true summation. Though many people assume white supremacist is a term reserved only for those who avowedly embrace a belief of white racial superiority, like racism in general, the term white supremacy is actually more nuanced. Because the American cultural context in which we live and move and have our being in is one in which whiteness is presumed to be the default in so many, if not all, aspects of life. Our society is rightly described as one that elevates those people and things associated with whiteness while subordinating or denigrating those people or things associated with other racial identities. I have learned and been challenged by the insightful work of so many people of color who are far more reliable narrators about whiteness than even the most self-critically aware white person. And I continue to learn and be humbled by my own ignorance and deeply ingrained racism. To put it bluntly, most white people in the U.S. don't know who we are because, as the great writer James Baldwin observed, whites typically live in illusion of our own creation and support the perpetuation of the lie of neutrality, normalcy, and supremacy by means of opposition and othering. White identity is so often framed as, I am not X, or I am not Y, and so on. According to this formulation, to ask what does it mean to be white leads to the inevitable if unspoken response, it means to be not black. This is an instance of what scholars call social binaries, the either or, where individuals and groups form identities over against and in opposition to another group that is typically viewed by the dominant group as lesser than and inferior. If you haven't read it yet, I commend to you the historian and journalist Isabel Wilkerson's great book, Caste, in which she does a tremendous study of this. I wish we had more time, but, like I said, I'm a teacher, so I'm giving you hope. This sort of dynamic is not limited to race as the only determining category, of course, but also applies across a broad scale of systemic oppression And we can see that with all the kinds of forms of isms, right? When we talk about the social binary of gender, we say, there's male privilege and there's, women, we experience sexism, for instance. We can go on. As the legal scholar Harlan Dalton summarized, he says, race exists only in relation to one another. Whiteness is meaningless in the absence of blackness. The same holds in reverse. Moreover, he writes, race itself would be meaningless if it were not a fault line along which power, prestige, and respect are distributed. On this last point, it's worth noting that race is about meaning-making in the American context. It is, on the one hand, an arbitrary system of valuation tied to appearances and perceptions and external categories. This is what we mean when we say that race is a social construction, and Sister Anita began talking about this and helped us see this morning. However, it's important for us to remember that that system, that social construction, is arbitrary. That is, it doesn't have any objective grounding in science, something Sister Anita also said. It has nothing outside of particular social contexts. This doesn't mean that race is unimportant or irrelevant. Because as soon as we say, I don't see race or it doesn't matter, then we're missing our history and its consequences today. On the contrary, because we live in a society that places an immense amount of significance on race, even if it's not often spoken aloud, it's still there. It is extremely consequential for both the beneficiaries, white folks like me, and those who are harmed or disadvantaged by the same system, black folks and other people of color. As the philosopher Charles Mills explains, this racial dichotomization was not incidental. It's not coincidental. Oh, this just happened. Right? It was not just that the rulers happened to be white and that the subjected happened to be non-white. Rather, race was absolutely central to the justificatory ideology of the period, of the 18th, or we might revise that to 16th century through the 20th and 21st centuries. It was precisely because of alleged white superiority to other races that whites saw themselves as entitled to rule over others. And I thought Sister Anita did a fabulous job showing us how this thread is traced through our own church documents and history. The meaning assigned to skin color or phenotype arose from a system of power, shaped in particular by the European colonization of what is today North America. Beginning with, and we should never forget this, the dislocation and genocide of the indigenous peoples of this land, and then the emergence of the Atlantic slave trade. Just as the meaning of blackness, or to put it more bluntly, non-whiteness, developed and shifted in accordance with the historical circumstances of oppression and white supremacy over the last 500 years, so too did the meaning of whiteness. That's the other thing. It's not like this has been a universal thing. This has developed as well. Even if whiteness was neither easily or deliberately recognized. Race is, as the renowned Princeton historian Nell Irvin Painter states, race itself is an idea, not a fact, and its questions demand answers from the conceptual rather than the factual realm. Which is why, as Sister Anita also pointed out, you're not going to find in DNA or in biological sciences any concrete scientific grounding for racial injustice. To begin to understand what race is, one has to grapple with the history of a concept, of an idea, and to reckon with its fluidity. Dr. Painter explains, constructions of whiteness have changed over time, shifting to accommodate the demands of social change. For example, various groups of European immigrants, my own ancestry, which is predominantly Irish, or Italians, or Eastern European Jews, and so on, were considered as embodying various degrees of whiteness, which established a hierarchical casting of those who might today comfortably identify or be categorized as white. That there has always been a shifting sense to the meaning of race highlights what we mean when we talk about it as a social construct. That's not made up, that's not theoretical, that's a fact. It is something not determined by something objective, but by social declaration and learning. I'll just say too, we're seeing this happen right now in an interesting way, one that I hadn't entirely noticed until I was on a panel at a college in Connecticut a few weeks back. And I was joined by a black philosopher and a Latina professor of social work. And she said something very interesting in her kind of groundwork, not only her practice, but her kind of activism particularly around energizing Latinos and Latinas to vote. And she said it's interesting when the last census came around, there's a new kind of subdivision of category. There's white, non-Hispanic white, and Hispanic white. And she said, as a Latina, as somebody of Cuban descent, she said, isn't this interesting that now Latinos are somehow kind of one foot in the white category? And this mirrors the great fear of the shifting demographics of this country. So just something for us to continue to keep in mind. This is not back in the olden days, this is today. Whiteness is one among many socially constructed races in our American context. But for most of us white folks, we have been conditioned to view ourselves as non-racialized, and therefore, quote, normal or neutral or default when viewing ourselves in relationship to others who are not white. Realizing the truth about the arbitrariness of racial classification and its lack of biological grounding helps us to see the world with greater clarity and nuance. If we white folks allow ourselves to continue learning, over time our awareness of the meaning applied to and the consequences arising from racial categorization will increase, and our ability to recognize that two-sided coin of racial injustice and privilege will improve. But here's the thing. We have to keep working at it. And I'm speaking from my own personal experience. As somebody who is very committed to this work, who's written a book about it, who's up here today talking to you at the very kind and gracious invitation to be here, even though it's something that's on my mind and I know a lot about, as a white man in the United States, the tidal force of the water pushing against me to ignore it, to look away, to give up, to not pay attention, to say it's easier just to let somebody else deal with it is immense. And so that's part of what is ours, the cross that is ours to pick up and carry. Jesus asks his followers, can you drink from the cup from which I drink? My fellow white folks, are we willing to live and move and have our being in Christ as well and drink from that cup? So I want to talk about then what the impacts of this may be. And I want to do so in terms of our society and the church. And I want to do so in three ways. To talk about whiteness as normative, as I've been talking about already. I want to talk about whiteness as invisible. And I want to talk about whiteness as property. All three of these examples offer just a small glimpse. There's so much more, but this is just, I hope, a tasting menu of what's to come. If, as Sister Anita encouraged our students and all of us to keep reading, to keep doing the work, to keep gathering like this. So first, whiteness is normative. As I mentioned, because we live in a society in which whiteness, both phenotypically, skin color, and this is about more than that. It's a cultural reality too, whiteness as a cultural reality. Our student reporter from the table talked about cultural appropriation, and so we need to realize that whiteness is associated with cultural identification as well. More on that in a minute. But because whiteness in our context and our society is considered supreme, that is default or normal or ideal, we can say that those who are identified as white and that which is understood to be related to white culture or identity is considered normative or standards. As simple as that. The dynamics are binary in that oppositional identity formation I mentioned earlier arises from society assigning meaning or value to characteristics of any given racialized group. When whiteness is understood as normative or ideal or held as supreme, this does not merely mean that it is equal difference applied to other racialized groups, as if there were binary but positively complementary meanings. It's not like it's not separate but equal, to invoke a phrase that is very relevant to our conversation. Instead, as with all else in this two-sided coin of racial injustice, one categorization is valued positively or desirable, while the other is valued negatively or understood to be undesirable. We see this all the way down. It is not my experience or story to tell, but internalized colorism arises from this same dynamic, right? Scholars will point out. We see this play out in so many different ways when whiteness is positively valued as the ideal racial category. For example, being identified as white means never having to think about one's racialized identity or self as part of a racial grouping. Nobody ever has asked me, Dan, what do white people think about X? Feel free at the panel to ask me. And I tell you the same thing my siblings of color would say, I don't know. You're going to have to ask a lot of other people. Conversely, being black in the same context means being hyper-vigilant about real and perceived dynamics of whiteness in order to negotiate social settings. And sadly, it's also often a requirement for survival. Another example, being identified as white means being the beneficiaries of a society that prioritizes one's comfort in a wide variety of contexts, especially when difficult topics inducing racial stress are introduced. And this is why I want to add again my thanks to all the folks who are gathered here today. This is important. This is, for many of us, very uncomfortable, and for all of us, perhaps for different reasons. But white comfort is prioritized and protected. Conversely, being black in the very same context often means having one's feelings, history, and experience dismissed, denied, or erased, while never having one's comfort given social value. Another example, being identified as white means almost always fitting in and having a sense of unearned belonging or entitlement to spaces and places. And on top of that, my clerical privilege and my maleness, and I can go wherever I want. That's the taught social perspective. Conversely, being black in the same context often means experiencing a palpable sense of alterity, of otherness, of difference, while being perceived as a perennial outsider or other. Now, I have so many stories to relay. I wish we had more time for that. So many stories in this room, for sure. Amen. Being identified as white means one's experiences presumed baseline for normalcy, acceptability, and propriety. We see this in our classrooms, we see this in workplaces, we see this in churches. Conversely, being black, often in the same context, means frequently experiencing the devaluation of cultural and historical heritage, art, aesthetic preferences, fashion and style choices, among so many other experiences and cultural identities. Being identified as white means benefiting from widespread social presumptions of goodness, trustworthiness, and competence, which we do not deserve, not without demonstration like anybody else, but conversely, so often being black in the same context regularly results in unfounded presumptions of criminality or being perceived with suspicion. I could go on, and you can add to this. We could be here 4 weeks. When we talk about a systemically racist or white supremacist society, we are always already talking about a setting in which whiteness goes unquestioned as ideal, with the tragic consequence that otherness is always positioned oppositionally and negatively. I want to talk about whiteness as invisible. White women and men like myself do not generally talk about whiteness because the dynamics that make possible the burdening and oppression of persons of color also simultaneously, as I've mentioned, cover up the reality of whiteness as a racial marker within the web of relations where we find ourselves. The philosopher Sarah Ahmed highlights that whites do not generally recognize whiteness because they are socialized to believe that their identities, perspectives, and cultures are simply the norm or default, that is, the way things ought to be. Think about that for a minute. She writes, "It has become commonplace for whiteness to be represented as invisible, as the unseen or unmarked or non-color, the absent presence or hidden referent, against which all other colors are measured as forms of deviance." George Lipsitz explains whiteness is everywhere in U.S. culture, but it is very hard to see for whites. As the unmarked category, again, against which difference is constructed, whiteness never has to speak its name, never has to acknowledge its rule as an organizing principle in social and cultural relations. The philosopher George Yancey likens the socialization of white folks into whiteness to the manner in which native English speakers learn English growing up. This was an eye-opening metaphor for me. Dr. Yancey says, one learns English in the context of every day by hearing it spoken. The subject of the language learning process does not self-consciously incorporate the grammar of English. Yet parents engage in correcting the linguistic performances of their children. This is part of what it means to inhabit a linguistic community. Likewise, white people inhabit a racialized community in which we become white through subtle, uncritical, and tacit socialization. At times, there are stronger signals sent to correct the racial grammar, we might say, of white performance. But oftentimes it goes without saying. One image that comes to mind for me is, think about being down in the 4th Street Live, right? And there is a white mother with a young white daughter, and they're holding hands walking down on one sidewalk. And directly across from them on the same side of the street is a young black man walking toward them. As the man approaches this mother and child, the mother just grasps the hand of the little girl just ever so slightly tighter. She never says anything out loud. She never uses a racial slur. She never says, you should be afraid of this person, or this person is different from us, or I'm afraid, but she's teaching something unspoken. Often goes without saying. Because we white people have been formed to think of ourselves and our experiences as normative, it can be so difficult for us to see that truth. I'm speaking from my experience. This is not the case for people of color, who very often continuously confront these messages, subtle and explicit, that they are, quote, not normal or different or other, or euphemistically, how many people have heard this, quote, ethnic? I've got a great story I can tell you if we have more time about a classmate of mine in Friar Formation who said to me one time, oh, Dan, you're not ethnic. I was like, I don't know what that means. He was Peruvian. I was many generations of Irish American, and I came around. If you want to know more, I tell the story in the podcast, or I'll tell you at the break. But this is something that the scholar, this notion of this dynamic, is something that is not new. It is not new. It's not something that, oh, we just heard about. I think, for instance, of the great civil rights activist and scholar W.E.B. Du Bois, who understood this personally and understood this as a scholar when in 1903 he described the presence of double consciousness. The double consciousness that black folks experience when confronted with the structural, institutional, and historical realities of American racism and white normativity. Du Bois writes, it is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his or her two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. This sense of whiteness meaning universal belonging or entitlement is something that I've come to see with greater clarity over time, and it has helped me to reckon with the fact that we live in a white supremacist culture, which presumes my whiteness as the norm and those who look different from me as the exception or other. Living in a racist society not only champions those aspects of my formal cultural formation and worldview, my own senses of beauty and forms of comfort, but also makes clear that anything that does not reflect or conform to those standard norms is viewed or treated as inferior or even worthless. Scholars like the sociologist Joe Hogan have described this phenomenon as the white racial frame. Hogan explains that the white racial frame is the dominant racial frame that has long legitimized, rationalized, motivated, and shaped racial oppression and inequality in this country. This white racial frame is a centuries-old worldview that has constantly involved a racial construction of society by white Americans. This is part of what is meant by white privilege. Namely, that to be white in America is to be typically unaffected in any negative way from the universal presence of whiteness as the social and cultural expectation and norm in nearly all aspects of our shared social life. Whiteness is property. 30 years ago this year, the legal scholar Cheryl Harris published an important article in the Harvard Law Review in which she coins the phrase whiteness as property. Harris painstakingly demonstrates, including from her own historical past, her own family tree, how the legal system in the United States from its very founding established whiteness not only as a racial characteristic that distinguished some people from others in an arbitrary manner based on appearance or judgment, but also as a traditional form of property that bestows on individuals categorized as white certain rights and privileges. You see this probably most famously in the legal case Plessy versus Ferguson, right? where 1/8 of one's racial heritage and identity is identified as non-white, and therefore all of you is considered non-white.
Yeah.
I also like to remind people that President Barack Obama was as white as he was black, if you're looking only on that standard.
Yeah.
So she outlines this, and she says furthermore that these advantages were identified with the white individual such that they were always present as the personal property of that individual. And I want to quote Harris here. She says in that article, "Whiteness defined the legal status of a person as slave or free. White identity conferred tangible and economically valuable benefits, and it was jealously guarded as a valued possession, allowed only to those who met a strict standard of proof. Whiteness, the right to white identity as embraced by the law, is property, if by property one means all of a person's legal rights." Like other kinds of property, whiteness accrues value over a lifetime. This is another way to refer to the reality of white privilege we've been talking about. As I mentioned earlier, the term can be somewhat misleading in that a common sense understanding of privilege would seem to suggest that white people should be able to recognize some concrete material benefits, or at least not experience, for example, financial hardship. I've heard some white folks say that to me before. You talk about white privilege, where's my check? Well, that's not what we're talking about, because you can see privilege may not be the best term, but the reality stands. Life, particularly in a society such as ours in America, is neither that simple nor that easy. We are more than just our race. We are also gendered and abled and intellectually variant and have a range of financial resources and education and opportunities. This realization that identity and social context is the result of multiple, complex social and power disparities requires a form of analysis sometimes called intersectionality, because it understands a particular person's circumstances and social location, requires analysis of all those intersecting social structures and dynamics. That said, within a racist society such as ours, one's perceived race plays a disproportionate role. One only has to think of examples like that, as I mentioned already, former President Barack Obama, or the Harvard professor of history, Henry Louis Gates Jr., both of whom are very successful and intelligent and powerful and fairly wealthy men. And yet both have experienced discrimination and racist vitriol because they are also black men. Conversely, even the poorest, least educated, and otherwise socially disadvantaged white man will never have to endure in this context the subtlest racial discrimination or the most overt racial animus on account of his race. The reason why reverse racism does not exist is because racism, like all the other isms, is when discrimination is tied to power. So you can have, misandry is real, I'll be honest with you. I've experienced this as a man in the world, where there are other men or women who don't like men because they're men. But that's not sexism. Because as a man in this culture, in this society, that is not going to affect me. It's not going to cost me my job. It might cost me my feelings. But that's about it. The concept of whiteness as property then articulates the material benefits that are collectively accrued to those identified as white in the U.S. One of the obvious impacts of this phenomenon arising from whiteness considered supreme is the foreclosure of comparable benefits to those who are not identified as white. Over time, this results in generational material inequality, as well as the persistence of generational trauma. So for us to not face our history head on is to reinscribe that trauma. So where do we go with this? I want to talk about spirituality. I want to tie what I presented to the theme of spirituality, namely addressing what Father Brian Massendale, a Catholic priest and moral theologian at Fordham University, calls the soul sickness of racism. Years ago, Father Massendale coined this term, the statement that recognizes that racism is more than just an individual, social, or institutional problem. Racism and its complement of white privilege are wisely likened to a spiritual illness. As Massendale explains in a 2014 address, he says there are many ways to understand racism, namely as a political issue, as a sociological phenomenon, and as a cultural divide. But for me, at its deepest level, racism is a soul sickness. It is a profound warping of the human spirit, one that enables human beings to create communities of cold, callous indifference to their darker sisters and brothers, stripped to its core, Racism is that disturbing interior disease that enables people to not care for those who do not look like them. In 2021, in a presentation to a Carmelite community in Baltimore, Maryland, Massengill reflected on how he arrived at that coinage. He was reflecting on where did this term soul sickness come from. And he says, this phrasing, soul sickness, is one that I coined. The phrase came to me when I was sitting in an airport lounge watching news coverage of the St. Louis District Attorney's decision not to indict the police for killing Michael Brown in 2015. Massengill continues, he says, Brown's uncle was being interviewed. He was distraught and overwhelmed with emotion, his angry sobs overtaking him as he lashed out at the failure of the system to obtain justice for his nephew. Massengill continues, he says, but as I watched the faces of the overwhelmingly white crowd who viewed the broadcast, and he says that he's the only black person in the area, I saw stony faces, hardened, impervious at this outpouring of grief. White faces fixed in anger at the indictment that was being leveled against American society. I was stunned. I wondered, what has so twisted the souls of these people that they are not only unmoved but hardened at the grief of someone who lost their young child? Would they be so calloused if this were a white young man whose death was being mourned? This is what led me to talk about white supremacy as soul sickness. Massengill goes on to note that this soul sickness is a cultural reality. It's culturally induced indifference, leading to an unconscious refusal of empathy and concern. I'm reminded of the Jesuit moral theologian at Boston College, Jim Keenan, who talked about sin. He said, you know what the most basic definition of sin is? He says, sin is failing to bother to love. It's not even being successful at it, it's just not even bothering. This is part of that soul sickness. In describing some of the impacts of whiteness, I hope to have highlighted some of the ways in which what is often experienced as invisible or not immediately consequential for those identified as white actually contribute to the great harm and oppression of our siblings of color. In the Catholic tradition, there is a way to understand our sinful culpability beyond discrete and deliberate actions. We call this sins of omission. We prayed together an act of contrition led by the Archbishop in which we acknowledge what we have failed to do. And we do this most Sundays before Eucharist. For many white people, the impacts of whiteness, especially the harmful consequences for people of color, are instances of sins of omission. A failure to see clearly, to understand intentionally, to accept reality for what it is, and all its unpleasant historical and contemporary truth. And then to do something about it. Because the failure to do something about it is a sin. It's a failure to bother to love, but it's also a failure to do what we ought to do, what God is calling us to. Likewise, in our Catholic tradition, we understand one's life journey as ongoing, as something like a pilgrimage. We are a pilgrim people, the Council tells us. We are called to ongoing conversion and growth. It's never too late. St. Francis of Assisi, at the end of his life in the 13th century, said to his brothers as he was dying, he said, "My brothers, let us begin again to follow the gospel, because up until now we've done little or nothing." Okay, St. Francis can recognize that. What's our message? Not just for people who wear an 800-year-old brown dress like me. Reflecting on the soul sickness of racism and the religious and spiritual implications for white people especially, I'm reminded of the work of the German theologian Johann Baptist Metz, a Catholic priest and theologian and scholar. In his book, Faith in History and Society, Metz describes two kinds of memories. The first is the sterilized form of memory, in which we just do not take the past seriously enough, and we recall everything in a soft, glowing light. This type of memory is usually evolutionary or progressive, reflecting a trajectory of history moving toward an increasingly better world. It was bad back then, but look how far we've come. The other type is what Metz calls dangerous memories. Dangerous memories, memories which make demands on us. The latter are what he sees constituting the Christian narrative. Our faith tradition, our belief, Christianity is a religion of dangerous memory. It's when we take seriously the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Metz explains that these dangerous memories illuminate for a few moments And with a harsh, steady light, the unquestionable nature of things we apparently come to terms with, and that show up the banality of our supposed realism, they are to shock us, and make us see what it is we say we believe. Far too often, the history of anti-Black racism in the United States is reduced to the sterile, cliched, and comforting former type of memory. The stark reality of indigenous genocide, chattel slavery, Jim Crow, xenophobia, the continual destruction of Black lives, and our collective complicity in its perpetuation is reduced to a caricature. You know, we celebrated that last month, right? Wait, now it's March, right?
Yeah.
Time flies. Well, and the shortest month of the year is Black History Month in this country, coincidentally, or not such. But I think about this when we whitewash the legacy, for instance, of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. or others.
Oh, yeah.
We don't want to face the dangerous memory. Alternatively, when it comes to our shared history of slavery in this country, we tell a story about the triumphant work of the liberator, martyr, Abraham Lincoln in the Civil War, which overshadows the complexity of a past marred by the indescribable suffering of generations of persons that have been dehumanized, sold, owned, raped, murdered, and destroyed. Many whites who have the luxury to look away and forget do. This is a selective memory that silences the oppressed, the victims, and the dead. This is a kind of memory that allows the sins of American racism, the original sin as Sister Anita rightly named, and white privilege to continue today, an unquestioned status quo, shielded by our willful ignorance and the desire for historical progress. What happens when we acknowledge that maybe we haven't come as far as we think? But systemic racism in this nation in all its forms is a memory of the latter kind in its honesty. It's a dangerous memory. Like the resurrection of Christ, which can never be separated from his life and death, there's something redeeming about calling to mind the suffering caused by American slavery and its continuing effects. What is redemptive isn't the belief that all is okay now. Rather, the way toward redemption in our Christian lens is directed by an awareness that things are actually very far from okay. What makes the memory of American slavery so dangerous is that in calling to mind the suffering of history's victims, we begin to see that the suffering continues. Hope is found in the interruption that cries of Black Lives Matter and the indisputable witness of horrific racialized murder, as in the case of Mr. George Floyd or Miss Breonna Taylor, even closer to home, make in our everyday lives and presumptions. This interruption should shock us into hearing the muted cries of history's victims that we hear announced in Psalm 34, and recall that although we are many parts, we are one body in Christ. White people like me have to work very hard, as I've said, to train our vision on the dangerous memories. We want to look away, and our society encourages us to do so without any consequence. We need to train our vision on the dangerous memories that tell the story of our collective history. The system is set up to shield us from seeing this truth, and we need to continually lift that veil of willful ignorance. This is the first step to laying the foundations of an anti-racist spirituality. My invitation to fellow white folks like me in particular, interested in training one's sight on this truth, on these dangerous memories, is fivefold. And I just apologize, I don't have this on a slide, so I'll speak a little bit slower, even though we're coming close to lunch. First, let us not seek to preserve our racialized comfort over the discomforting facts of racial injustice that beckon our response. We need to let go of that comfort. We need to learn. Two, let us avoid defensiveness and the temptation to dismiss, minimize, or erase the real suffering experienced by those harmed by systemic racism. Third, let us recognize the impacts of whiteness taken as normative and call out, reject, and seek to dismantle such cultural and societal hegemony. Four, let us open our eyes and our ears and our hearts to acknowledge that whiteness is a constructed racial identity that has tremendous impacts in our society and institutions, rather than just close ourselves off to allow for continued invisibility. Five, let us work to dismantle the proprietary character of whiteness in our context so that greater equity, justice, and peace may abound. Thinking again of that call for our school systems to look at our handbooks, to prioritize whose voices are included and who has a place at the table. While education and awareness are indeed important, it's necessary for us to recall that that they are just the beginning, Response and action are what must follow. So how do we, especially white folks like me, pursuing the spirituality of anti-racism, what do we do? I'm inspired by the Christian authors, the Mennonite scholars, Regina Stoltzfus and Tobin Shearer. They provide us with a succinct description of what they mean by an anti-racist spirituality. And here's another bibliography note for your homework. They have an excellent book called Ben in the Struggle, toward an anti-racist spirituality. Ben in the Struggle. In that text they say, among so many other bits of wisdom, an anti-racist spirituality is a way of being in the world that draws on the unknown and the unknowable, which some call spirit, others name the divine, goes by the word of mystery, relates to us as God, to encourage, empower, and enthuse amid the intention and the action to undermine the systems of white supremacy around us. They further note that it fosters truth-telling, first to oneself and then to others. It lifts up communal efforts. It is not afraid of hard conversations. It invites laughter, joy, and human connection. And they're so good about that. We can't just all be doom and gloom. That dangerous memory, right? As the Holy Father, as Pope Francis says, there are too many Christians who go around acting like they are Good Friday Christians and Easter Sunday never happened. The problem, though, is when we push too quickly past Friday and Saturday just to get to Sundays, and that never happened. This last point is significant because this inevitable stumbling blocks, uncertainty, missteps, mistakes, confusion that arise when folks, especially white folks, commit themselves to the work of addressing the soul sickness of racism and its complement of white privilege, we need to not get bogged down entirely in the difficulty, as difficult as it is. Reflecting on the significance of identity formation and how our respective social locations inform so much of each of our ways of being in the world, these two authors talk about what churches and other faith communities, especially those that are predominantly white, need to do. They say in order for faith communities to have genuine, sustained conversations about race, they must understand white supremacy and its effects, what have driven economics, politics, and other systems that Black people must encounter and navigate daily. Recognizing that the work of anti-racism is multidimensional, these authors note that it has at least three broad components. We must bear witness, we must foster justice, we must sustain the work for the long haul. For Christians, these three dimensions ought to be grounded in and supported by our ongoing recognition that the work that is done is not merely a social agenda, but is something that also requires our attunement to the presence of God. It's not something we do because it's a political idea, or because it's best practices in our workplaces, or because the pastor said so. We do this because the Spirit of God calls us to it. As we heard in the gospel last Sunday, for some of us, the Spirit may be leading us into the discomforting places where we do this work. But for many of us who aren't reading Luke or Matthew's gospel, the Gospel of Mark uses a different word, where the Holy Spirit is still going to push us there, but it's going to drive us like the Spirit drove Jesus into the desert, not just leading somebody who's willing. So we might ask ourselves, how does my prayer inform or is shaped by the call to work for racial justice? Where is God in the midst of my learning and relearning and bearing witness? What sort of examination of conscience can I make in order to reflect on the socialized racism in my own heart, in my own thoughts and my own practices? Let me close. The womanist theologian Kelly Brown Douglas recently wrote, "Just as white supremacy has not disappeared, neither has the religion that fosters and legitimizes it. As white supremacy has transformed itself through the nation's history to reflect the customs and constraints of the time, so too have white supremacist versions of Christianity. In our own time, these racist renderings of Christianity have simply adapted to 21st century cultural mores and political sensibilities, thereby manifesting in ways perhaps more subtle, but not less blatant." Echoing and building on the observations of her foremothers and forefathers who have long noted the role of Christianity as a conductor of white supremacy in this country, to borrow an image from the sociologist Robert P. Jones, Douglas is reminding us of both white supremacy's insidiousness and its hiddenness. Pope Francis has also drawn the church and world's attention to this dimension of soul sickness, writing in his 2020 encyclical letter Fratelli Tutti that racism is a virus that quickly mutates and instead of disappearing, goes into hiding and lurks in waiting. If you take one thing away from anything I've said to you, take this with you. If folks in the Church of Louisville, in your parish, in your school say to you, the work of anti-racism or the work of racial justice is not Catholic, it's oppositional, etc., just share with them this quote from the Holy Father's encyclical. As I hope to reiterate in this presentation, racism is more than just a social problem or a national issue. It is a spiritual disorder, or as Father Brian Massengill aptly calls it, a soul sickness. My interest in offering these points of reflection was to primarily address my fellow white folks who aren't afraid to look at the difficult truth of our complicity in structures of systemic racism and white supremacy. This is an invitation to begin laying down the foundations of an anti-racism spirituality, seeking renewal in heart and mind by means of reckoning with the reality and the impacts of whiteness. Christianity challenges all of us to penance, to growth, and renewal on our spiritual journeys. But for our spirituality to bear the characteristics of anti-racism, we white folks in particular must begin to do the difficult work of lifelong learning, conversion, and action. Otherwise, although we may individually not commit discrete acts of racist violence and may never have used a racial slur in your life, we will nevertheless continue to reinforce distorted forms of Christian life through our sins of omission, which is our failure to know and do those things which we ought. My sisters and brothers, there's much work to do, but let us do it together now and as we go into the future. Thank you.
All right, so now you know why, as soon as we heard Father Dan, we had to bring him back to Louisville. So Father Dan, let's just give you another round of applause. Thank you. So before we do the break for lunch, this is going to be a working lunch, so you are going to have a discussion, and the food is here and in the back, and I give you instructions about that. But first, I would just want to do a few quick announcements. So on pages 32, 33, and 33, there are details about upcoming events, and Father Dan mentioned CAST. We are having a book discussion about that on March 27th. So details are in there if you want to join us. We have Stations of the Cross. We have a virtual version, and just call or contact our office to get the Zoom link. And there's also an in-person version at St. Patrick's on March 15th. And again, the details are there. And then for the schools that are here, our office is planning a series of roundtables with those who are in diversity, equity, and inclusion positions, those who work with any student of color groups, those who are doing any of this work, whether you have the title or not in our schools. And so the dates and times are in there for through 2024. And we would love to see you. If you have any questions, please contact our office and give us the names and contact information for those who might be attending so we can plan, and we will make that happen. On page 33, we have information about our Moving Forward Oneness program. We've had a number of parishes in our Archdiocese go through that.
and details are there. And how many people have been to a movie toward oneness? Raise your hand. So if you have any questions, there's a number of people in this room that can give you more details, and that's just a small sampling of people that have participated. So there's information about that too. Finally, on page 35, there is a feedback form that we would like you to fill out and give to us before you leave at the end of the day. So just tear it out. We love these folks, but you're feel free. Just tear out the page and give it to us whenever. Before you leave, one of the staff people will leave it on the table, and we'll get it. We have, in terms of lunch, we have 5 choices: turkey, tuna.
And think about how we're going to be nourished physically. And so we pray, oh God, you who are both mother and father to us, we ask you to bless this food that we're about to eat. We praise you and thank you for those who brought it to this table, from farmers to truckers to caterers. We praise you and thank you for eyes that can see it, noses that can smell it, taste buds that can enjoy it, and stomachs that can digest it. And we pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.
The Son and the Holy Spirit. Always work.
Thank you. Now I know. So, any groups that want to ask a question or give any quick comment or feedback, if you want to come up, if you didn't come up before. So, any tables that have anything from the second presentation? Before moving to
I want to say something on
the local school system and the challenges that we all face. But also, one thing that I'm very curious about, but also troubled by, is the intersection of violence and racism. And it seems like we won't be able to address one without addressing the other. And it feels huge, but it's something that I think we can't ignore, that there's so much intersection